Lena stopped at the entrance of the tall skyscraper and took a deep breath. She had come this far. There was no turning back now. She gripped her bag tightly, adjusted her clothes, and headed for the elevator. She felt a light excitement, but more than that, she was nervous. After all, this wasn't just a job interview. It was an opportunity that could change her life. Atlas Corporation was one of the largest companies in the city, and someone like her being hired here was highly unlikely. But maybe, just maybe, she had a chance. The only problem was the man at the top of the company, Adrian Blackwood. Just hearing his name sent a strange shiver down her spine. He was known to be cold, distant, never smiling, and never giving anyone any leeway. She had heard plenty about him. Employees were even afraid to speak directly to him. But Lena didn't have time to worry about that. When the elevator chimed and reached the top floor, she took a deep breath and stepped out. The secretary gave her a brief glance and pointed to the CEO's office with her hand. Lena nodded and lightly knocked on the door before entering. The office was bigger and more impressive than she had expected. The ceiling was nearly non-existent, with glass walls stretching across the entire city, making it seem like it was all at her feet. Behind a massive desk, the man in a suit sat straight-backed, looking every bit the part of someone to be reckoned with. Adrian Blackwood. Lena hesitated for a moment. The man was staring at her with an unreadable expression on his face. His eyes were sharp and cold, as though analyzing everyone in front of him. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm Lena Carter. I'm here for the job interview," she said, trying to make sure her voice didn't tremble. Adrian didn't say anything for a moment. Then slowly, he placed the pen he had been holding onto the desk and fixed his eyes on her. "Sit down," he said, his voice as deep and imposing as she had expected. Lena sat down in the chair across from him without overthinking it. It was then she realized that Adrian Blackwood wasn't just a cold person. There was something he was hiding, and Lena was determined to uncover it. Trying not to look him in the eyes, Lena pulled the file from her bag. She had to force herself to steady her hands so they wouldn't shake. This man's aura was changing the entire atmosphere in the room. Adrian took the file and quickly started flipping through the pages. His expression remained unchanged. Lena pushed aside the unease she was feeling and waited. Finally, Adrian looked up. "Quite a good resume. But this is what everyone who wants to work here has," he said, his voice emotionless. "Why should I hire you?" Lena swallowed. Despite being prepared, the way the man was looking at her made her forget all the words she had planned to say. But she quickly regained her composure. "Because I'm not an ordinary person, Mr. Blackwood. I didn't come here just to look for a job. I came here to make a difference. If I become a part of your team, you can be sure I'll give it my best." Adrian stared at her for a few seconds before slightly smiling. This smile was one that seemed to change the temperature of the room in an instant, but even his smile held a kind of distance. "You're overly confident," he said. Despite these words, Lena didn't step back. "You can't survive in the business world any other way." Adrian tilted his head as if he liked the response. He closed the file and placed it on the desk. "All right, Lena Carter, I've decided to give you a chance. Be here at 8 tomorrow morning," he said, looking at her with a challenging gaze. Lena was taken aback. She hadn't expected him to decide so quickly, but she quickly recovered and nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. You won't regret it." As she was leaving, she heard a voice behind her. "It's entirely up to you, Lena." His voice. There was something hidden in it. Lena couldn't quite understand it at first, but over time she would come to realize that Adrian Blackwood was not just a cold CEO. He had a past that no one knew about, and Lena, unknowingly, was about to become a part of it. 1 week later, Lena had learned a lot in her first week at Atlas Corporation. Adrian Blackwood was as expected, tough and ruthless. He didn't forgive latecomers and had no tolerance for mistakes. But there was something else that caught Lena's attention. Adrian would sometimes disappear for a few minutes. No one knew where he went. Sometimes he would be alone in his office for hours. And one night, when Lena accidentally went down to the company's archive department, she found Adrian looking through old files by himself. When he noticed her, his expression softened for a moment. But then, he quickly returned to his usual cold demeanor. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Lena swallowed. "I got lost." Adrian squinted at her. "I hope so." But in that moment, Lena realized something. Adrian Blackwood wasn't as strong as everyone thought. He was carrying a burden inside. And maybe, just maybe, Lena was very close to figuring out what that burden was. Lena noticed the shadow in Adrian's eyes. There was something behind his tough and distant demeanor. But she didn't know exactly what it was. That night, she was the last to leave the company. Adrian's office light was still on. Before leaving, she paused for a moment, curiosity eating at her. Finally, she sighed and knocked softly on the door. "Come in." Adrian's voice, cold and authoritative as always, called from inside. Lena opened the door and stepped inside. Adrian was sitting at his desk, examining an old-looking file. But when he saw her, he immediately closed the file and fixed his eyes on her. "Is there a problem?" Lena took a deep breath. "Actually, I just wanted to check if you're all right." For a brief moment, Adrian's eyes seemed to flicker with surprise, but he quickly regained his composure. He made a gesture that resembled a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "That's not my employee's responsibility, Lena." Lena crossed her arms. "Maybe it should be." Adrian frowned. "This is the business world, Lena. There's no room for weakness here." Lena took a step forward. "Weakness? Or are you running from your past?" Adrian stiffened. His eyes became as sharp as a knife. "What do you mean?" Lena held her breath but didn't back down. "I've noticed something since I started working here. Sometimes you disappear. You go through files, but no one knows what you're looking for. And sometimes, it's the look in your eyes. Adrian, you're not just a tough guy. You're running from something." The room fell silent. Adrian took a deep breath. Then he placed his hand on the desk and slightly lowered his head. "Running?" he muttered. Then he looked up at her. For the first time, it seemed like something inside him had broken. Lena stood at the entrance of the towering skyscraper, taking a deep breath. She had come this far, and there was no turning back now. She gripped her bag tightly, straightened her clothes, and headed toward the elevator. Inside, a slight excitement lingered, but it was overshadowed by tension. After all, this wasn't just a job interview. It was an opportunity that could change her life. Atlas Corporation was one of the biggest companies in the city, and for someone like her, getting hired here seemed unlikely. But perhaps she had a chance. The only problem was the man at the top, Adrian Blackwood. Just hearing his name sent a chill through her. He was known for being cold, distant, and never smiling. No one dared speak directly to him. But Lena couldn't afford to be distracted by that. When the elevator dinged, reaching the top floor, she took another deep breath and stepped out. The secretary glanced at her briefly before motioning toward the CEO's office. Lena nodded, lightly knocked on the door, and entered. The office was even bigger and more impressive than she had imagined. The ceiling seemed non-existent, and the glass walls stretched out to reveal the entire city below. Behind a massive desk sat the man himself, dressed in a sharp suit, radiating authority. Adrian Blackwood. Lena paused for a moment. He looked at her with an expressionless face, his sharp, cold eyes analyzing her as though he could see right through her. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm Lena Carter. I'm here for the interview," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Adrian remained silent for a moment, then slowly placed his pen on the desk, his eyes never leaving her. "Sit," he said, his voice as deep and imposing as she had imagined. Lena quickly seated herself, not daring to overthink it. She could tell that Adrian Blackwood wasn't just cold. He was hiding something, and Lena was determined to uncover it. She pulled out her file and tried to keep her hands steady as she opened it. The air in the room felt thick, his presence shifting the entire atmosphere. Adrian flipped through the file quickly, his face as expressionless as ever. Lena waited, doing her best to suppress the unease creeping up inside her. Finally, Adrian lifted his gaze. "Impressive resume," he said, his tone indifferent. "But everyone here has something like this. Why should I hire you?" Lena swallowed hard. Despite being prepared, his gaze made her forget every word. But she gathered herself. "Because I'm not just ordinary, Mr. Blackwood. I didn't come here just to look for a job. I came here to make a difference. If I become part of your team, you can be sure I'll give it my all." Adrian stared at her for a few seconds, then gave a slight smile. It was the kind of smile that made the temperature in the room shift. But even his smile held an underlying distance. "You're overconfident," he said. Lena didn't back down. "In this business, you can't survive without it." Adrian tilted his head, seemingly intrigued. He closed the file and placed it on the desk. "All right, Lena Carter, I'll give you a chance. Be here tomorrow at 8 a.m., he said, his eyes daring her to prove herself. Lena was taken aback. She hadn't expected him to make a decision so quickly, but she quickly recovered and nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. You won't regret it." As she turned to leave, she heard him speak one last time. "It's all up to you, Lena." His voice, there was something hidden in it. At first, Lena couldn't make sense of it. But soon enough, she would realize that Adrian Blackwood was more than just a cold CEO. He had a past that no one knew about. And whether she realized it or not, she was about to become a part of that past. 1 week later, Lena had learned a lot in her first week at Atlas Corporation. Adrian Blackwood, as expected, was tough and unforgiving. He didn't tolerate tardiness, and mistakes were never overlooked. But Lena noticed something else. Sometimes Adrian would disappear for a few minutes. No one knew where he went. Other times, he would spend hours alone in his office. One evening, when Lena accidentally wandered into the company's archives, she found Adrian alone, looking through old files. When he noticed her, his expression softened for a moment before quickly returning to its usual coldness. "What are you doing here?" he asked in a low but firm tone. Lena swallowed. "I got lost." Adrian squinted at her. "I hope that's true." But in that moment, Lena understood something. Adrian Blackwood wasn't as untouchable as everyone thought. He carried a burden, one that no one could see. And perhaps, Lena was closer to understanding what it was than she realized. Later that evening, as the last person to leave the office, Lena noticed Adrian's light still on. She stopped before leaving and hesitated. Finally, she exhaled and knocked gently on his door. "Come in," came Adrian's voice, cold and authoritative as always. Lena entered, and Adrian, who had been examining an old-looking file, immediately closed it and fixed his eyes on her. "Is there a problem?" Lena took a deep breath. "Actually, I just wanted to check if you're okay." For a moment, Adrian's eyes flashed with something. Surprise, maybe, or something deeper. But then he quickly regained control. He gave a smile that resembled a grin, but it held no warmth. "It's not your job to worry about me, Lena." Lena crossed her arms. "Maybe it should be." Adrian furrowed his brow. "This is business, Lena. There's no place for weakness." Lena took a step forward. "Is it weakness, or are you running from something?" Adrian stiffened, his eyes turning sharp as a blade. "What do you mean?" Lena held her ground. "Since I started working here, I've noticed something. Sometimes you disappear. You look through old files, but no one knows what you're searching for. And sometimes, there's a look in your eyes. Adrian, you're not just a tough guy. You're running from something." The room fell silent. Adrian exhaled deeply, then placed his hand on the desk, slightly tilting his head. Running from something? He muttered, then met her eyes. For the first time, there seemed to be something breaking within him. Maybe you're right, he said softly. Lena opened her mouth to respond, but Adrian continued. You know, Lena, sometimes a person's past becomes their chains, and no one can see those chains. Lena realized, for the first time, that Adrian wasn't just a distant, cold CEO. There was something more to him, something hidden deep within his past. 1 week later, things at the company were still busy, but Adrian wasn't as harsh or distant anymore. At least, that's how Lena felt. He was still serious and controlled, but there was something different in his gaze. Then came the day. Lena entered Adrian's office to deliver a new project file, but she wasn't alone. Across from Adrian sat a middle-aged man in a suit. The man's eyes narrowed when he saw Lena, and Adrian leaned back in his chair, his eyes becoming cold. I finally caught you, Adrian, the man said, his voice icy. Lena instinctively swallowed. Adrian put on a fake smile. It's brave of you to come all this way, Victor. The man, Victor, pulled a small piece of paper from his pocket and placed it on the desk. When Lena glanced at it, she realized it was an old newspaper clipping. Heir to billionaire family mysteriously disappears. Lena's blood ran cold. Adrian took a deep breath. You found me. What do you want? He asked, his voice steady but tense. Victor smiled. Your old boss sent me with a message. Lena furrowed her brow. Boss? Adrian's face darkened. Victor looked at Lena briefly before turning back to Adrian. You didn't want them to know you were here, did you? But sadly, you can't escape your past. Lena stepped forward. Adrian, what's going on? Adrian looked at her, his mouth dry. He wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Victor chuckled. Poor girl. You still don't know? Do you really know who he is? Lena's spine tingled. Adrian remained silent for a moment. Then he muttered, I think it's time you found out. Then he turned to Lena and said the words that shattered her world. I wasn't just an heir to a billionaire family. I was the son of one of the most dangerous men in the criminal world. Lena's breath caught in her throat. And at that moment, her life changed forever. Victor wasn't just an old enemy or a reminder of the past. He was part of something much bigger. Seeing Adrian's expression, Victor smiled with satisfaction. Your father sent me because he believes there's no reason for you to hide anymore. Lena's eyes widened. What do you mean? Victor pulled a USB drive from his pocket and placed it on the desk. Your father wants you to return to your throne. Lena's heart pounded. Throne? Adrian glanced at the USB and then turned back to Victor. I won't go back to his world. He won't get anything from me. Victor shook his head. You can't make that decision alone, Adrian. He turned to Lena. Especially not with this girl here. Lena shuddered. What does this have to do with me? Victor smiled faintly. Because you're his biggest weakness. Adrian's face hardened. His fists clenched. Don't drag Lena into this. Victor shrugged. You know, we love playing with emotions, Adrian. This is a warning. You either join your father or you let everyone suffer the consequences. Lena gasped. You can't do this. Victor laughed. Sweetheart, we can do anything. He gave Adrian one last look. You have 2 days. Either you accept your father's legacy or you let everyone pay. With that, he left the room. Lena turned to Adrian. What does this mean, Adrian? Adrian closed his eyes. It means everything is about to begin. Lena's insides churned. Adrian's face showed the seriousness of the decision ahead of him. Lena swallowed. Adrian, tell me the truth. What does your father's legacy mean? Adrian took a deep breath, avoiding her gaze as he walked toward the window. I didn't want you to get involved in this, Lena, but it's too late now. Lena couldn't understand what he meant, but she knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about business anymore. It was about survival.